Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. My name is Shobhankita. I'm a researcher in technology geopolitics at the Takshashila Institution. And for this conversation, I'm joined in by my colleague Bharath. Hi, Bharath.
Hello.
Well, so we have been in a heady news cycle the last 3 weeks at this point, and the war in West Asia is obviously consuming a lot of our mind space. But for this conversation, I thought we'll discuss something that's a little less talked about, not the direct impacts of the war, the lives lost, the missiles used, the targets hit, and the impact on energy prices, the LPG crisis that we've been seeing, or even the impact on Indian diaspora. I think the energy element as well as the Indian diaspora is India's largest interest in the region. But for this episode, we want to talk about maybe the second and maybe even third order effects of this war, and specifically its impact on technology supply chains and AI. Fair warning, there is some speculation here, some open-ended questions, and some effects that we're already seeing. So I didn't know about this until we started reading about this recently, Bharath. But, Qatar produces a third of the world's total helium supply. So this Iranian attack on Qatar's LPG as well as gas facility really took a third of the world's total helium supply offline. And helium is a byproduct of natural gas processing, and it's necessary for semiconductor production. So we see how something that was hit during the war in Iran essentially took the world supply chain down by 1/3. And even the memory chip market in Korea specifically, between Samsung and this other firm SK Hynix, which dominate essentially 70% of the world's total memory chips, they are highly import dependent. And so the energy prices going up, the Strait of Hormuz potentially being closed, or just the uncertainty around that, means that their operational costs have gone up. And the helium was in some sense a double whammy, right? Because the semiconductor production is now under threat. And of course, this is not necessarily a product of the war, because we've seen some market distortion and skewing of the market for memory chips even before this war broke out, even before the first missile was shot. That was to do primarily with the AI investment boom and many of these firms in memory chips essentially shifting production from the DRAM market to the HBM market, which is just AI chips. So we see how these repercussions from the war have only further intensified, the market distortion and change in priorities that were already underway as an effect of the AI investment boom. And now potentially we're looking at DRAM prices again going up and potentially supply chain disruptions affecting, broadly the semiconductor chip market for the next year or so, if I'm trying to speculate on timelines. So this was all new to me. So this short-term supply chain disruption is perhaps one effect, right?
So I think the idea about helium being an important part of the semiconductor manufacturing process is something that many of us would not have been aware about. So basically, it has excellent conducting properties. It's used to, take away heat during the manufacturing process, and it serves a lot of applications like from MRI machines to semiconductor manufacturing and so on. And the supply chain for helium is concentrated in a few countries. Qatar was one of the major producers. You have the United States, Russia, and a few other countries being other sources where it's produced. And so now, while it might not be something that's really difficult to produce or something that's
substitutable,
not substitutable. I mean, maybe helium might be unique in the properties that it has, but you might be able to produce it from in other places or increase the capacity in other places. But the short-term disruption that was caused as a result of the war is something that companies would have to deal with or find ways around, right? So, and that's something that is maybe a second or third order impact, like we were discussing. So, in terms of the impact itself on this particular thing or inputs like this, you don't see it as potentially leading to a crisis the way oil is. Helium is one of the inputs. There are many other applications for helium. And maybe in a crisis like this, when the supply is restricted, you'll find that higher value sources will be able to, higher value users will be able to capture that supply that is there. So maybe the semiconductor manufacturers will be able to pay a higher price and capture that, the limited supply that there is. So you'll see that this won't be a disruption that will stall it, maybe, but it might be something that will lead to companies having to figure out how to deal with this, or figure out alternate sources of supply. And maybe other users of helium would find it harder to, at least in the short term, to get access to this, right? So short term disruption, but not likely leading to a crisis, is what you might think of this. But the bigger question is maybe how a lot of these places, where countries, even in India included, we are dependent on West Asian energy for a lot of our needs. And some of these, like we've always spoken about, so you have a very concentrated supply chain for AI and for semiconductors, which are part of that value chain. Say in countries like South Korea or in Taiwan, most of their energy imports come from this region, and this kind of a disruption here would have a ripple effect in energy access to these companies, and that might further create problems in how these inputs are available to the rest of the world, right?
Yeah. I think the other thing that I didn't know about prior to this was almost 95% of the world's DRAM market, which is largely consumer chip market that goes into laptops, phones, etc., was concentrated essentially in 3 companies in the world, and 2 of them in Korea. That is highly energy dependent again for oil imports from this region. And sometime in January this year, I'd noticed that phone prices had gone up 1.2, 1.3x, but I didn't necessarily pay attention to it to the extent that I am now. So it looks like OEM manufacturers had been warning about price increase by 15 to 20% for a while now, essentially because the AI investment boom had meant that many of these producers had shifted their production and prioritized AI investments and just the demand for AI chips coming from the hyperscalers. And they've entered into these long-term contracts with the hyperscalers in a way that the consumer market is a little bit squeezed at this point. How do you think this will play out? Do you see some kind of a status quo shifting in some period of time, or do you think this will take at least 1-2 years to settle?
Well, this is not directly related to the war in Iran. It's, I think, a shift that we're seeing in these companies which are producing specific kinds of, say, memory chips. And now they're having to, with a surge in demand for high bandwidth memory, which is specifically used in AI training or inference kind of use cases. These manufacturers choose, like you were saying, they're prioritizing production of these chips because they're higher revenue and higher margins compared to the DRAM, which is more of a commoditized product, which might not be as profitable. So you see this shift, but the overall capacity might be limited, and to increase that, it might take a longer time. So I guess in the short term, at least, you'll see a supply crunch in some of these products, and that's where you see prices also responding to that.
Yeah, and if anything, the Iran war has brought some of these acutely to our attention, and it might obviously take a little more time to settle. In terms of a slightly more mid to long-term perspective on maybe a second, third order effect of this war, what's interesting is data center facilities in these regions have been hit by drones and attacks from Iran or Iran-funded proxies. Data centers in Bahrain and UAE is at least what we know were hit. So how do you see this playing out? So firstly, I thought it was very interesting how the IRGC, defended having attacked this. They said this was a legitimate target. So maybe we start with that.
So I guess the Iranian strategy has not always been to counter the US or Israeli, forces on in terms of the military power and meet them on an equal footing, but also to wage a kind of disproportionate where they can put economic or political pressure and try to use that as leverage to inflict pain, right? So, and you see that the message was very clear when they tried to attack energy facilities like the gas facility in Ras Laffan in Qatar. So that was kind of a way in which they are pressurizing the Gulf countries to not have US bases as a. That's the kind of message that they're trying to send. And in this particular example, when they say that they see data centers as as a legitimate target. So basically, their argument was that you have AI being used for military applications, and these data centers might be powering those AI applications. So that makes it a legitimate target. So a few data centers by AWS or Amazon Web Services were the ones which were attacked by drones. And so this is something that's not happened before, right? So this is the first time a data center has been attacked in an operation like this. So the first time that this happened, and maybe that sets a precedent for in the future what can happen. But interesting consequence of these kind of actions is that we see that in West Asia, in say in the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, you've seen a lot of investments in AI and AI infrastructure. So you see OpenAI, Microsoft, all investing in these countries, and a big part of that appeal to invest in those countries was that there was a lot of energy, was cheap, land was easily accessible. You had government backing for these kind of projects. You had maybe even sovereign wealth funds who were investing in these kind of things. So you had a lot of favorable conditions, which made it seem like a good destination for some of these investments. But now with these risks to data centers or them being seen as a target, what does that mean for investments in the future? So you already have a lot of investments which have already happened or are in the pipeline. But will that change how investors look at this? Is something that's
Yeah. So I think definitely a precedent for data centers being hit. And now we, I think, have a new category of what may be considered critical infrastructure in need of military protection. Previously, data centers were not considered that, but I think AI use in defense may provide some kind of a reason to have military protection from kinetic strikes. Previously, it was maybe just cybersecurity threats that you would need to safeguard against, but this just adds another dimension to that. And in terms of what this means for investments in the region, I think for already built capacity, it's very difficult to lift and shift shop, primarily because many of these contracts are long-term. They're long-term power agreements, long-term land agreements. These are, in some sense, difficult to suddenly get out and move from. And also moving workloads is not so easy, just in terms of the data and AI workloads that these servers were operating. But I think this geopolitical risk will now be factored in for future use cases. I think this is just another dimension to maybe 6-7 other things that were previously being considered. Previously, you would look for water availability, you would look for power and stable power, you would look for tax incentives, you would look for a whole bunch of these in terms of your land evaluation and just its suitability to set up a data center. But I think just in terms of geopolitical risk, I think that will just be factored in a little more.
And I guess that's the message that Iran is also trying to send, that we're going to make life difficult for you if you try to attack us, and this is a legitimate target in our opinion.
Yeah, I thought what was also interesting was Saudi Arabia and UAE essentially having these deals explicitly with the US, where it was investment for access. So they would invest in AI infrastructure by US companies in return for access of high-grade chips from these companies, right? So part of these data centers may have also been part of that deal. And we see that financialization of AI in some sense potentially as something that can happen, which is that and what was also interesting was the Trump administration's flirtation, if I may, with this policy draft some time ago, which they've now retracted, but we'll see what comes of it. And essentially what that policy draft said was, it was a rebranded version of the Biden administration's AI diffusion rules, where they said, depending on how many chips and what quality and exactly what kind of workloads you want to use these chips for, you may have to, commit to infrastructure and investment in the US, or at least of these US companies. So there were reports about this potential policy draft was essentially to say if you need more than this threshold, you would need to do government-to-government negotiations, and you would need clearance for some another threshold. So it was very interesting, right? Like, what does this then mean for smaller companies trying to get access to these chips? Like, for example, if Servam AI wanted these chips and couldn't necessarily commit to investing in the US, then does the Indian government need to step in? Would Reliance's investments in the US potentially subsidize that? So it had opened a can of worms for a while, which it had closed. So clearly, I think the long-term viability of those deals that Saudi Arabia and UAE have cut with the US will hold, at least, for the medium to long term. What about the long-term effects of this, right? Firstly, we have had massive investments in AI by the hyperscalers to the tune of 650 billion just this year. I mean, the numbers are a little mind-boggling at this point. They're also running into trillions, so we don't really know what numbers to believe. But clearly, there is some impact on what this means, right? What do you think this means for the valuations of these companies, their profit margins, and just are we headed towards an AI investment pop, the bubble?
Yeah. So I guess a lot of these valuations are driven by the expectation that there will be a lot of applications that use AI, and there's a lot of revenue to be made in the future, at least, which makes it seem reasonable to invest these large sums of money in building out the data center capacity or to develop the most capable models that are out there. So, like you're saying, the scale of the investments is mind-boggling. If you look at it as a function, as a percentage of the GDP, it probably exceeds, in terms of what the US companies have invested in building out this AI infrastructure. It's exceeds the Manhattan Project or the moon landing or even the .com era, the broadband build out that had happened, right? So it's far greater in scale than all of those kind of investments, and the expectations is that there will be uses in large parts of the economy, a lot of downstream applications, and all of that revenue is something that can potentially be captured. But there's different opinions about this. So in terms of what exactly is the trajectory of these of generative AI, maybe a few years down the line, is it going to keep scaling up at the same way in terms of the capabilities that it has? Will it really be able to do all of the things that these companies say that it can do? So there are different opinions about that, and that's where you see that there are a lot of expectations that all of this money that has been put into it is being funded also in a very vendor financing kind of a model. So, for example, uh, Nvidia, which is manufacturing a lot of these chips, is then investing back into, say, OpenAI or Oracle or a bunch of other companies, which then use that capital to buy more chips or invest in data centers. And it's just a cycle which makes it good for the valuations of these companies. But if they're not able to generate those returns in the future, it makes it an inflated kind of a situation, which is not sustainable. So what happens when you have a situation which slows it down? So like if you're talking about the war in Iran expanding to a regional kind of a war, and that also impacting the global economy, that impacting investments into investments into AI, into all of these kinds of things that these companies are banking on. Does it mean that a lot of these companies might not, the timelines for profitability would be stretched? So I guess that's something that's a big concern, a big concern for at least companies that are investing into this.
Yeah. And I think if we were to really stretch the timelines and the impact of this war and take examples from the Iran-Iraq war, the Gulf War of the 90s, the 1980s and the 1990s, then we may be heading towards a long-term stagflation if this continues, right? At one end, we will have high oil prices and we will also have inflation throughout, but the appetite for demand and GDP growth would be stalled. So that's this worst of both worlds in some sense, where you have a stagflation scenario. And in that sense, that might actually impede AI adoption as well, right? I mean, if everything slows down, then AI adoption in some sense may slow down. And if we were to again speculate on what that means, I think in some sense, we would see the impact on profitability of these firms as well as their valuations potentially compressing. But again, very long term, one scenario of that also exists.
So I don't know. So like we're saying, this is speculation. So does stagflation kind of a scenario extend these timelines, or does it compress it? Because you see that AI can make you far more productive than having a larger team of people would. So
Right.
would you take decisions that to compress those AI adoption into a much shorter time frame? So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how these things will play out, and the war and the spill out onto on different parts of the economy are just going to make it a lot more complicated. I guess even just in the past few years, right? So you see that generative AI has been around for a few years now, and it's rapidly, the capabilities are increasing. And in that time, we have not been able to get a sense of what impact it is having on the workforce or on the economy, because there have been a lot of other factors which are also at play. So it's hard to say that the impact is solely because of AI. And it's impacted these sectors to this extent, because there's also been a post-pandemic recovery or slowdown because of the pandemic. And then you had the tariff wars that are going on, where there have been a lot of disruptions to supply chains, a lot of changes in the way business is done because of that. So, and on top of that, you have you're trying to understand what impact AI has on jobs, right? And it's just a harder thing to understand when all of these things are going on. And with a war like this also added to the mix, it makes it far more challenging to understand what's going on, and to respond in terms of how you deal with it from a policy perspective. I guess that's something that you need to have a sense about if you're trying to govern it effectively.
Yeah. Weaning out the specific impacts of the war vis-a-vis AI adoption, while both of them is happening parallelly.
Yeah.
I think that's just the uncertainty of the world that we live in. Thank you, Bharath. With that, we shall close this speculation. But I think some of these effects we are already seeing, and some depend on how long this war stretches, right? In some sense, it's not in the best interest of anybody for this war to stretch. It's not in the interest of the Gulf countries, because their economic model is essentially about stability. It's not in the interest of Iran. They would not want this to forever stretch as well. But Iran would be interested in getting some concessions out of this round of battle. And until we see some light of that, I think this would be difficult, even this round to end, because Iran would always be worried about the next round of battle starting from Israel, because Israel is, at least at this point in time, looks like very keen on complete decimation, right? In some sense, capability to be destroyed, so that Iran is not necessarily a threat to them, at least in the medium to long term. So we see competing interests, and we also see, effects that can spill over and affect us and broadly the global economy. So thank you for this conversation, and we'll see our listeners in the next episode.
Thank you. And like you started with, I guess there are far serious consequences of this war: the humanitarian crisis, the impact on the livelihoods of the people over there, and all of that. So this is just one sector, and we're trying to understand what it's doing to that sector, but second and third order impact of the war. But yeah, interesting space to watch and see what happens.
Yeah. Thanks, Bharath.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.